Hey guys, welcome back to Daska Discusses. Well, it's time for a review, and well, it's time to look at the Netflix original Fear Street Part 1, 1994. What's interesting about this is that it's based on, the Fear Street books by RL Stine. You might remember him from like Goosebumps and the Goosebumps movie that came out, and I used to read a couple of Goosebumps books back in the day, but I was more of a Stephen King kind of fan, so never really got around to reading these back in the day. Nonetheless, though, it is horror and it's based in the 90s, and I'm like, yep, I'm going to watch this and see what it's all about. Now, I do remember seeing the Fear Street books back in the library back in the day, back in the 90s. So, let's have a bit of a discussion about Fear Street Part 1, 1994, and whether or not it's worth your time to watch it on Netflix. And I will be very limited with the spoilers, right? So I'll try not to do anything bad. Well, I'll try not to spoil anything, obviously. So yeah. So let's do this, shall we? Now, I've got the IMDb screen here in front of me, as you can see. Now, Fear Street. The synopsis. A circle of teenage friends accidentally encounter the ancient evil responsible for a series of brutal murders that have plagued their town for over 300 years. Welcome to Shadyside. Writers, RL Stine, and then you got the story, etc. Now, how do you put this? Look, what's happening here with Fear Street is that it really drew me in terms of like that retro nostalgic kind of feel. Now, as soon as I see something based in the 90s, I'm like, yep. I grew up in the 90s, and even, for example, something with like Stranger Things. I was talking to a couple of friends about it. Stranger Things, even though I was like really, very young in the 80s as well, that whole nostalgia of seeing certain things and toys and music and the costume, it really gets you in there, and it hooked audiences, and it was actually a great show. So not only did Stranger Things have that aspect of, it was a nostalgic trip down the past and all the things about Dungeons and Dragons, and it had that feeling of like the Goonies and other 80s movies. It had a really good storyline, and I know the TV series is a bit different to this, but it drew you in, and it didn't like really go overboard with the nostalgic stuff at times. Fear Street, look, the first 10 minutes, it was pretty riveting kind of viewing, and I must say, yeah, for them to pay homage to a classic 90s film, again, not going to spoil it, you'll see it, but the exact type of shot, how they actually constructed it, the cinematography, and how it all turned out, and the actual part when it happens, when, it's a really full-on opening sequence. Not going to spoil it, but I'm like, aha, well, that's paying tribute to the classic movie from the 90s that we remember. And you'll know as soon as you see it. If you grew up in the 90s, you'll know, right? There's that. There's also the fact that the first 20 minutes of Part 1, Fear Street Part 1, is littered with, like, non-stop soundtrack cues. So the soundtrack is, like, either got Cypress Hill, or there's Nirvana, or there's Radiohead. There's a whole bunch of different songs that they use, right? So I'm like, okay, you got me there, Netflix, with this soundtrack. I'm impressed, right? You got me, I'm impressed. You've got me in terms of the nostalgia feel of this. I'm starting to enjoy this. You've got the homage to I'm not gonna say it. Nearly did. Got the homage to the old 90s horror film that I really like. Plus, you've got this soundtrack that I remember growing up as a teenager, right? Fantastic. Now, let's just have a look at some of these pictures, shall we? Why not? So, poster, look, as you can see, you've got the main character there. You've got these two characters, this skull character and this other guy, which I'm not going to get into too much. Now, it is a trilogy, right? So, again, first couple of shots of someone playing I think it's a Sega Genesis, I can't remember, but yeah. I'm not going to spoil it too much. Let's just keep going, shall we? In terms of the cast itself, let's have a look. Christina Madeira as Dina, Olivia Scott Welsh as Samantha Fraser, Benjamin Flores as Josh, Julia Raywald as Kate, Maya Hawke as Heather. I remember her from Stranger Things, I'm pretty sure. Then you've got some other guys here as well. But the actual storyline of this town being cursed, and again, not giving away too much, but these friends that uncovered this ancient evil, I found it really interesting, in the first 20-25 minutes, and the way they play around with the storyline, thinking that certain characters, oh yeah, you think that she's just broken up with her boyfriend, but it's actually, no, it's they flip that, it's her girlfriend, so that was interesting as well. But as the movie goes on, I find that, violence doesn't really bother me in terms of like, the amount of gore and blood, no big deal, but it is quite gory. I wouldn't recommend it for kids, obviously. It's rated R in America, which is, I think, MA here. Well, I know because I teach this. MA here in Australia. So it is quite graphic in terms of the violence, but again, if you grew up in the 90s, you're like, oh yeah, well, 90s horror movies had this. It pays homage to 90s and a lot of 80s horror films as well, like Friday the 13th as well, you could say. But this whole aspect of all this ancient evil coming back and haunting these kids and this town is an interesting concept, right? So put it this way, trying not to spoil things here, but the first probably half an hour of this is quite good. The movie goes for, let's have a look, an hour and 47 minutes. The first half an hour to 40 minutes, I kind of like was intrigued where it was going. However, things start falling apart once we get the actual premise of what's actually happening and this curse, and you got these two towns fighting. You got one which is Shadyside. What is it? Shadyside is the one that's cursed, and then you got Sunnyvale, which is like rivals. You don't really see much of that. I find that all these murders and all these really graphic, gruesome killings keep happening, yet they happen in different locations, and it's kind of like, this is what happens. Movie's broken up into great opening sequence, great opening kind of acts, and then it goes to like murder, 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 and then a quiet kind of conversation for like a good 10 minutes. Another murder, and then a conversation for 10 minutes. A real deep and meaningful D&M conversation between certain characters. And that kind of took me out of it, because I'm like, you've got all these murders happening around you, yet you guys are sitting there talking about your feelings non-stop. I get we're trying to do something with character development, character construction. I get that, and who's going out with who, etc. But the one relationship in it, I kind of understand, yeah, that's in there, and I believe I've got that belief about it, that the main character and her girlfriend Sam. However, to have like another forced kind of like boyfriend thing, but the kind of forced romance subplot in the middle of the film is just ridiculous to me. And so you've got four characters, two couples that hook up, you could say, and then you've got this other random guy in it who's like the comic relief. And I found this part of the film, and you'll see it in the middle part of the film when they go to this building and they got to prepare for this big battle. It's kind of like, really? Is that what we're doing now? And that took me out of it, right? It's just a lot of scenes that really drag on a bit. Like, you've got this horror trope running through this movie, which is, really paying homage again to 90s horror films. And I know it's based on the book, and I know RL Stine wrote it, etc. So I can't really comment on how accurate it is to them. But as a film, it just seems that we've got these forced kind of dialogue and forced kind of conversations that break up the horror element of this film. Now, a lot of people are going to disagree and say, well, Daska, you have to incorporate that to the story, and it's part of a trilogy, and we've got to get all this kind of information. Yeah, but at times it just seems like it's a bit of a mess. The editing and the way they go about telling the story for the audience, it drags on, and that especially happens midway through the film. From midway, another 25-30 minutes in, until it leads to the final act of the film, which again is just a disjointed kind of mess in terms of, so the rules of this ancient evil coming back, right, and them killing certain people, all of a sudden they don't kill certain people. They're only going after our four main characters or five main characters. So it kind of like got me annoyed, because when you're used to, when you're going to pay homage to 90s horror films, and you're going to do this whole thing about, in the old films where the killer either kills everyone, like Jason, or goes after specific people, you either stick with that or you stick with the latter. This kind of like jumps from one to the other, kind of makes it a mess. The other evil characters that come in, which are awoken, are quite creepy, but I'm not going to call them scary. I'm looking forward to watching part 2, because Part 2 takes place in 1978. This takes place in 1994. So what I'm going to say is this. If you grew up in the 90s, you're a teenager then, you may enjoy parts of this like I did, the first act of the film. However, as the film goes on, you start to really dislike some of the characters. Now, I'm not saying anything against their acting styles, I'm just saying the way they're written. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy our main protagonist here. It's just that the motivations and their choices in this movie are just like, go from relatable and you're like, okay, I would do something like that, to no, that is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But whatever. And then you've got some throwaway sub characters, and you've got the sheriff in there who plays a bit of a role near the end. And the way it kind of like ends, it ends on a cliffhanger because obviously they want you to go and watch Part 2, which they've got me. I mean, I'm not gonna not watch Part 2, so that is my review, right? You can take what I said and make up your own mind. Now, in terms of a final number, like rating for this, again, started off really good, and I was looking, wow, this is looking at like, maybe an 8 out of 10 if it continues like this. But as it went on, I am serious now. I give Fear Street with I wanted it to be good, but I'm gonna give Fear Street a 5.5 out of 10. 5.5 out of 10. Now, looking at IMDb, they gave it a 6.2. That's pretty much where it could sit at that. If we look at Rotten Tomatoes, 81% from reviewers, 63% by the audience. You know what? I really am a fan of Rotten Tomatoes, especially. I just think that it's quite interesting to see that nearly a 20% jump of that in terms of the audience score. I think it sits in this. I'm giving it 5.5, which is like 55%. It sits at 63% on Rotten Tomatoes. So 5.5 from me. You will like it if you're a horror fan and you love 90s horror, then watch it. But beware, if you didn't grow up in the 90s and you're just into some sort of horror and you want to see what Netflix can serve up, then you may enjoy this. However, if you're not into like violence and gore, you definitely won't. I'm looking forward to seeing Part 2. That is my take on Fear Street Part 1. It's very difficult to go through these reviews, guys, without spoiling it, but that was a spoiler review on Fear Street Part 1. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and probably see you guys later for a live stream, who knows. But that's my review. Daska Discusses out. Catch you next time on the next episode of Daska Discusses. 3, 2, 1, and